Though, does it? It is by the Trons, which is a robot band. Time's Up is the name of the track there. Ladies 6 before that with Cold, and now 15 minutes past 9 on the Radio Wammo Breakfast.
The Radio Wammo Breakfast.
Live from the New Scientist Labs, Janine Young, newscientist.com.
Joining us in Melbourne City, Janine Young, good morning to you.
Good morning, Wammo.
Now, some nasty business with the weather, of course, in Queensland with that cyclone Yasi coming through. Just been downgraded once more. It went from a 5 to a 4 now to a 3, but that's still some pretty devastating force in that cyclone. Now, this is on top of the floods that have already occurred in some of those areas as well, and that's sort of what we are initially talking about, is the effect of flooding on the wildlife and the environment.
Yeah, it says that poor Queensland has offended some deity or some environment god. Poor Queensland at the moment is just copping it. Yeah, although things are particularly bad in Queensland at the moment, and frankly they really are, or it might have slipped from the headlines, but the clean-up going on around Brisbane and Toowoomba and places like that is still pretty serious. There may be some benefits in the mangroves around places like Moreton Bay. A map would be helpful at this point, but this is radio, so people can go Google it, and I'm sure that you'll be able to work out quite where it is. Yeah. Moreton Bay is just off the coast around Brisbane, and they're finding that with all the runoff from the agricultural lands, because a lot of Queensland's been washed out into the bay, frankly, there's still a lot of fertiliser and really nutrient-rich materials being washed out. I think that the mangroves, so that intertidal zone where you have effectively a break, if you like, you've got a whole bunch of plants that grow in there, really important areas, mangroves, may actually benefit seriously from this nutrient-rich runoff. Researchers are finding that in areas that have received a lot of this sort of runoff before, they can go from growing around 25 centimetres a year to more than 65, and it happens really, really quickly.
Wow.
So these extra nutrients are really kicking them along. But the same thing may not be said for the other coastal areas that don't have mangroves. What the nutrients are likely to do, and this happens in a whole bunch of other systems as well, is just increase algal blooms. What that does is creates effectively a dead zone, because all the algae suck up the oxygen, and it means that nothing else can grow. The algae in particular are voracious feeders, and they will suck up as much oxygen as they can to grow as fast as they can. It's just what algae do. You give them a chance and they grow.
Yeah, which could be devastating in say an area like the Great Barrier Reef.
Yes, because as soon as you have a dead zone, it means that nothing can live there. Fish can't live there. Brisbane is a fair way south of the Great Barrier Reef, but yes, it's one of those things that you don't really want dead zones anywhere around that area.
Yeah. Same
thing's happened in the Gulf of Mexico in the wake of the oil spill last year. Dead zones happen in various parts of the Pacific. It's actually a bad situation for that, but the benefit may be that the mangroves will actually be okay through all of this, and they'll actually do some good because they're an incredibly important part of the environment as well.
Well, that's right, and I guess that's part of one of those natural processes like bushfires, I suppose, where forests depend on bushfires for that new growth and regeneration. It's all part of, and in fact, how some plants reseed themselves as well. So I guess floods, bushfires, all these natural disasters, just part of that cycle.
Yes, and the environment will cope with it the best way it can. Generally, the ecosystems tend to be reasonably resilient. Some aren't. Some are very fragile, and some aren't able to with massive perturbations in what goes on. Time will tell. And unfortunately, the massive devastation that's gone on, and the cyclone further north, and it is further north than where all the floods went through, poor Queensland.
Yeah.
You can't help but marvel at nature's fury, because that's really what's been delivered at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, and I guess one of the price to pay, I suppose, for living in the warmer part of Australia as well. Tell us about cyclones, I suppose, in general, and how they form and why they're so destructive.
Cyclones can also be called hurricanes, and I'll make sure I'll get this right. The wind has to get above 119 kilometres an hour to actually be classified as a hurricane. But it's a hurricane if it's in the Atlantic or the Eastern Pacific, typhoon if it's in the Western Pacific, in the Indian Ocean or in the Southern Hemisphere. it's just called a cyclone or a tropical cyclone. So they're all the same thing. They all rely on warm surface water temperatures. It's got to be above 26 degrees, so they can really only form around the equator. You need reasonably still conditions. You can't have much wind shear from the bottom, so near the where the water is, to the top of where the hurricane is likely to form. It's got to be reasonably stable. You also need a whole bunch of spinning involved, because you've got to have something to get the air spinning. It's all to do with low pressure, high pressure, and how they combine together. But you must have warm water to start creating some of these pressure differentials. Over time, as it builds up more speed and it builds up more power, which it tends to pick up from other low pressure systems and the like as it runs around, and it's involved with other pressure systems that run around the planet. And we have jet streams, Coriolis effect, there's a whole bunch of other weather systems that help drive these things. Over time, they build up and you actually wind up with these massive, massive systems. Why this one has been so large is that it's tied in with a low pressure system that was out in the Pacific.
Yeah. And
also was coming up from the south as well. You have a number of categories. We mentioned before that it was a Category 5 when it crossed the Queensland coast. That means that you have destructive winds above 280 kilometres an hour, and indeed they did see gusts in Tully of 285. You can't comprehend how fast that is. But it's also to do with storm surges and the like, and how much damage it's likely to do. We haven't been able to see a great deal of information this morning about how bad the storm surges have been, but there's another high tide at 9:30 Queensland time this morning, so that's 12:30 Kiwi time, midday effectively.
Yeah.
And that means that you're going to get more water coming in. That works with the natural tidal systems. And as I said, we have a high tide coming in, managed to avoid the worst of it last night. But what a cyclone does is that it whips up a lot of wind. Obviously, that's what a cyclone is, along with the rain that it delivers.
Yeah.
And so the surface of the water gets whipped up, and that tends to become a bigger problem over time, because as it becomes periodic, you're able to get more friction on the water and the like. And so you wind up with this combination of a high tide, or a low tide as it was for Cyclone Anthony last week, which actually wasn't as bad as this. It was only a Category 3. Poor Queensland.
Yeah.
And so you actually start getting these extra problems. It's actually the storm surges that kill more people in cyclones than it is the wind damage. Apparently there was a cyclone in Bangladesh in 1971, and it killed 300,000 people once the storm surge came through. You can't get your head around these sorts of things. Cyclones are all about warm air and how they move around and how much power they pick up along the way. That's kind of the bottom line, if you want to be really simple about it.
And of course, as it moves over land, it should keep reducing its power, I suppose. But it's last report I heard that it was going to make its way all the way through to central Australia, of course, as a lower form cyclone, or in fact just a deep depression. In fact, Alice Springs is expecting a lot of rain, and also down into Victoria. And some of the mountain ranges up there as well. So certainly a lot to play out with this one. Janine, thanks so much. Of course, the story on flooding you can find in New Scientist magazine coming out next week, and also online as well, newscientist.com. Thanks, Janine. We'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.